In the meantime, let's also move on. Let's get into some of the details on this new ceasefire there between Russia and Ukraine in the Black Sea. Fox News correspondent Alex Hogan has a little bit more on this from London. Let's watch.
Agreed terms to a maritime truce. Both Russia and Ukraine greenlighting a plan to pause the fighting in the Black Sea, the critical defensive body of water on which both countries also rely for exports. It's the first significant step toward a full ceasefire amid U.S. President Donald Trump's pledge to swiftly end the war. The deal also includes a ban on targeting energy infrastructure for 30 days, a promise Russia says it will only trust with Washington's backing.
We will need clear guarantees. The guarantees can only be the result of an order from Washington to Zelensky and to his team to do one thing and not the other.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he believes the peace plan goes into effect immediately, although he expressed doubt that Moscow will hold up its end of the bargain.
If the Russians violate this, then I have a direct question for President Trump. If they violate, and here is the evidence, we ask for sanctions, we ask for weapons, and so on.
U.S. and Ukrainian delegates met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia today following talks between the U.S. and Russia. In separate agreements, the U.S. will help both countries on different fronts. The U.S. and Ukraine agreed to continue to work toward the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. The Trump administration has also agreed to help Russia increase its global exports of grain and fertilizer. Not all details are finalized. The Kremlin warns first sanctions must be lifted, and it won't give up control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
There are about 5 or 6 conditions. We're looking at all of them.
Despite days of diplomatic efforts in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, the fighting rages on. Both countries today accuse the other of continued attacks.
The White House says this is the first step at securing lasting peace, and the U.S. will continue to facilitate conversations between both sides moving forward. In London, Alex Hogan, Fox News.
Alex, thanks so much. This is how the White House presented these bullet points today about some of these recently agreed upon tenets of the proposal here. So they say this, the outcomes is how they describe it, that U.S. and Russia agree to keep navigation safe, avoid using force, and stop using commercial ships for military purposes in the Black Sea. It's also that the U.S. will help Russia sell its farm products and fertilizers in the world market again. Will also lower shipping insurance costs and improve access to ports and payment systems. Also, that the U.S. and Russia agree to create plans to follow President Trump's and Putin's deal to stop attacks on energy sites, saying both are happy to have help from other countries to support the energy and sea agreements, and that both will keep working to create a strong and lasting peace here. In the meantime, let's talk about all of this, major developments in this conflict, with none other than national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, good to see you here. Do you agree with National Security Advisor Waltz's assessment there on Lori Ingram tonight, that President Trump has broken the logjam in this war, that this movement, when it comes to a ceasefire, is to be welcomed, is to be celebrated by all sides here? And if so, if you agree with that assertion here, how should we take it? Should we be optimistic, pessimistic, agnostic?
Well, Andrew, there's a number of ways of looking at it. Actually, it's interesting. The president of Finland today was talking about it, and he was speaking of it in very kind of upbeat terms, the fact that there had been some agreement. Now, I will say behind the scenes, the Europeans are fully preparing for this thing to break down or not work. They also control the SWIFT system, which is the International Transaction Exchange. So some of the terms that are in there in terms of helping Russia with its fertilizer and grain, but also some of the stuff in being able to sell fuel, they want to be able to access U.S. dollars in the market. Without SWIFT, that's still a difficult system. So they're preparing, and then there's members of Congress who are also preparing sanctions, Lindsey Graham amongst them, preparing a list of sanctions that would be imposed if Russia breaks the agreement. So I think in one sense, Mike Waltz, yes, you have to give credit to the administration for getting these talks underway. When the Trump administration came in, there was no dialogue at all with Russia on any of this stuff. Certainly nothing even close to what we see now was in the offing. And here we are. We have a Black Sea agreement. and maybe an energy ceasefire agreement in terms of attacking certain kinds of energy infrastructure. With that said, I still think there's a lot of terms to be worked out. This idea it's going to be implemented immediately. I still think, particularly on the energy side, there's a few more things that have to be worked out. And I saw the list that the White House had put out, and I noticed there was one word that was missing from all those bullet points, and that word was Ukraine.
Now that you mention it, noticed that as well. That leads perfectly into the next question here. Conditions on this. Because it seems like Russia is affixing their own preconditions in the readout that the Kremlin put out here. And Ukraine didn't necessarily seem to be privy to some of those here. Help us make sense of that, Hal. What is Russia being promised by the United States that Ukraine may not know about here? Was this deal equally reached on both sides? And did the readouts from all the parties align? Were they almost identical, or were there slight differences?
Well, from what I can tell, President Zelensky is a little frustrated with this dropping of certain sanctions that allow Russia to re-enter the market. One of the things that Ukraine has done, Russia has expended a phenomenal amount of blood and treasure on this war. Over 900,000 troops have been lost, according to the Ukrainian General Staff. 900,000 Russian troops have been lost, I should say, according to the Ukrainian General Staff. The Russian economy is in dire straits right now. There are some experts that say sometime towards the end of this year or early next year that Russia will simply run out of any financial resources to be able to sustain this war. So they're kind of, by dropping the sanctions, allowing them to sell certain things in the global market, it gives a lifeline, if you will, to the Russian economy, which allows Putin to extend this war longer than what they were seeing. So they don't like that. On the other hand, it does open up potentially commercial shipping. And that's very interesting. It was very much tied to commercial shipping. They weren't saying anything about military shipping. And I thought that was interesting because when you talk about military shipping in the Black Sea, that's Russia. Russia has military ships with sailors on board that traverse the Black Sea, not Ukraine. Ukraine's been using primarily a drone strategy in stopping Russian shipping, naval shipping, I should say. So interesting choice of terminology there.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. It does seem like Russia wants access back to the world, the global financial market here. Now, Zelensky, you heard there in that soundbite in the report, quite skeptical that this is even going to hold here. So if it doesn't hold, Hal, we're not even sure when it takes effect, but if it doesn't hold, what are the consequences going to be? With the premise that Russia violates it first here, what are we going to levy against Russia in case of violations here?
Well, the first question I have is, who will determine the violation? Will the U.S. call Russia on that? And I don't know if that's going to happen. Ukraine calls the violation. Well, Ukraine's one of the parties, and certainly if Ukraine calls violation, Russia will call violation. Even if there was no violation by Ukraine, they'll just call it for any reason. So the question is, who's the judge? And the judge might really be, this may sound a little bit strange, but kind of in Europe. And the reason why is Europe has two things. Number one, they control all those frozen Russian assets, or pretty much not all, but most of the frozen Russian assets out there, $300 billion. Those are mostly in Europe. Second thing is the SWIFT system is based out of Belgium, not the United States. We have a say in all of this, or we had a say in all of this, but we don't have a dominant say. And so if Russia wants access to the world system, and if it ever wants to see its assets, it's going to have to start dealing with the terms. And right now, Europe is very energized in talking about seizing those assets. Members of Congress are very energized in trying to get Europe to take those Russian assets, those frozen assets, seize them, and move them to Ukraine. And if Ukraine suddenly gets access to, say, $200 billion worth of frozen Russian assets to pay for the war, that is a huge setback for Russia. At that point, it's inconceivable how Russia could financially sustain the war, particularly if more sanctions are put in place.
So, Hal, I wanted to ask you about that. So Russia, with some of these preconditions in the ceasefire, the U.S. helping restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems here. Do some of Russia's requests in this ceasefire spell out some of the economic anxieties and issues that they have been facing since this war began? Is the writing on the wall based on, if you want to read the tea leaves, of what Russia wants access to almost immediately?
Well, Russia wants access to go back to the way things were prior to the invasion of Ukraine. If they could get it, they would want to be able to sell their oil, their fertilizer, their grain, everything else on the world market and be able to get the proceeds sent back to Russia. Right now, it's a very cumbersome system. They're not really using dollars, and dollars is the currency of international commerce, if you will. So it's very difficult for them, even when they sell stuff, to get those proceeds back to Russia in a way that they can use them. So that's what Russia kind of wants from this. I think they're reaching a little bit. What I do find is there's a real gap between what seems to be the agreement and what Putin then comes back and says, well, this is what we think we're going to get from all this. It just doesn't seem to quite sync up. I would say Putin's got a little bit of an overreach rhetorically in terms of what he thinks this is.
Yeah.
But he could end up selling more fertilizer, more grain. You could see some oil going out of this agreement in ways that it wasn't going out before, not just all the dark tanker fleet, if you will, that they use, but other ways that they could get oil out. So that's very possible. That could come out of it. That's not what Ukraine wants to see, though, obviously, with that, especially with the oil.
So would you characterize this, though, as a lifeline, an economic one for Russia?
Potentially. Now, the other side of this, I'd like to say, though, is the way that, and I got to tell you, from the White House bullet points, again, missing that word Ukraine, I'm assuming that when they're saying that commercial shipping is allowed, they're saying Ukrainian shipping to Ukraine is fully allowed as well across the Black Sea. And that's a significant amount of shipping. Right now, when ships go up in the Black Sea from whatever nation going up to Ukraine, they have to take a rather interesting route to avoid potentially running into the Russian, not much of a naval blockade, but, staying away from wherever Russian systems could hit them. Of course, Russia's also littered the Black Sea with sea mines, and that's another issue. But they have to go through a circuitous route. And then, of course, when they're in, say, the port of Odessa or something, their ships can be hit by Russian fire. So for Ukraine, there is a reason why they would want to do this. Beyond Russia's motivation, they would want to open this up and allow those ships to traverse the Black Sea so they can get their commerce moving a little bit faster as well.
And Hal, just lastly on this, we're about to play a 7-minute or so long video Zelensky put out on his social media accounts today. It's in Ukrainian with English subtitles. But Hal, if you would, stick around because I want you to comment on that. Before we get to that, I wanted to ask you, I think it's worth reiterating that these are not trilateral talks in Saudi Arabia, that it is separate. The U.S. and Ukraine, the U.S. and Russia, the three parties are not at the table together. So how did this come to be?
It's weird. It's shuttle diplomacy. They got the Ukrainians in one area, they got the Russians in the other area, and the U.S. runs back and forth, says, okay, Russia's agreed to this, Ukraine is okay with this, or proposals, counter proposals, stuff like that. So it's very strange. I just find that the bullet points put out by the White House were a little bit odd, because I would have expected to see something about that Ukraine and Russia both agree. That would be language I would expect to see. What I'm seeing is that the U.S. and Russia agreed, and I'm not surprised that President Zelensky is a little bit put out by this, because I'm not saying that they bulldoze over Ukraine, but it does seem that there's a lack of inclusivity in the rhetoric or the language that's coming out of this thing. And so I'm just wondering how much Ukraine, did agree to in the specifics of the terms or the conditions.
Okay. Well, speaking of Zelensky, let's listen.
Бажаю здоров'я. Перш за все, сьогодні вітання Службі безпеки України, всім нашим воїнам СБУ. Сьогодні їх професійний день. Тож ми вітаємо, дякуємо усім, хто захищає безпеку нашої держави та робить абсолютно все, щоб російські плани не вдалися. Наша Служба безпеки України робить саме так. Зупиняє окупанта, знищує окупанта завдає потрібних ударів по окупанту, знешкоджує агентів та російських диверсантів. Дуже важливо, що Служба безпеки України стала справді бойовою спецслужбою. Сьогодні відзначив воїнів державними нагородами. Я подякував їм особисто. Сьогодні була також доповідь головкома Сирського. Фронт, Курська операція, наші результати. Вдячний всім підрозділам за стійкість. Цими днями зроблені деякі дуже потрібні речі на фронті. Дякую вам, воїни. Нам потрібні сильні позиції України в цьому, в усьому, починаючи з поля бою. Дипломатія теж потрібна сильна. Сьогодні весь день я на зв'язку з міністром оборони України, з Рустемом Умєровим, керівником нашої технічної делегації на перемовинах в Саудівській Аравії. Були хороші зустрічі з американською стороною вчора і сьогодні. Я хочу подякувати Саудівській Аравії та спадкоємному принцу за посередництво та гостинність. Все пройшло на високому рівні, є домовленості і доволі конкретні, погоджено з американською стороною, що сьогодні може початися припинення вогню щодо нашої енергетики. Ми вважаємо, що після публікації відповідної заяви щодо результатів зустрічей і всієї роботи команд сьогодні можна переходити до тиші щодо енергетики. Також команди обговорили, як повернути більше безпеки Чорному морю, нормальному судноплавству. Для України принципово важливо звільнення наших людей з російського полону, військових, наших цивільних, а також наших дітей, які примусово вивезені російськими окупантами. І я вдячний Америці за готовність допомагати в цих гуманітарних питаннях. І це зафіксовано в нашій заяві з американською стороною. Україна готова працювати максимально швидко та абсолютно прозоро для завершення війни. Але, на жаль, вже зараз і вже прямо сьогодні, прямо у день перемовин, ми бачимо, як росіяни вже почали маніпулювати. Вже вони намагаються перекрутити домовленості та фактично обманути і наших посередників, і весь світ. Є абсолютно чіткі заяви, які опубліковані Білим домом. Кожен може побачити, що там зазначено. І є те, про що знову бреше Кремль, що нібито тиша в Чорному морі залежить від питання про санкції. І що нібито датою початку тиші щодо енергетики є 18 березня. Москва завжди бреше. І це залежить від світу, від усіх, кому реально потрібен мир. Чи дозволять знову Москві брехати? Ми в Україні будемо все робити, щоб домовленості спрацювали і щоб не було ударів. Але росіяни повинні знати і повинні усвідомлювати, якщо вони будуть завдавати ударів, то вони отримують сильну відповідь. І відповідальність буде на них. І якщо росіяни потім будуть розказувати байки, що нібито удари були не по енергетиці чи цивільній інфраструктурі, всі все побачать. Я хочу нагадати, що ще з 11 березня на столі пропозиція Америки щодо повного і безумовного припинення вогню. Всюди, а не тільки щодо енергетики та в Чорному морі. Саме Росія на це не погодилась. Саме російська позиція затягує цю війну. Тоді, коли Путін не сказав так безумовному припиненню вогню, нових санкцій проти Росії не було. Зараз Москва щось там вимагає щодо зняття частини санкцій. Хоча 3 роки розповідає, що санкції їм нібито не страшні і навіть корисні. Але якщо не спрацює ще й ця домовленість, якщо росіяни не виконають умови сьогоднішніх домовленостей і спробують знов тиснути на Америку, на Європу, на Україну, то відповідь, вважаю я, має бути одна. Точно нові санкції, точно більше тиску. Те, як Росія буде себе вести найближчими днями, покаже багато чого. Якщо не все. Якщо знову повітряні тривоги, якщо знову військова активність в Чорному морі, якщо знову російські маніпуляції та погрози, то треба буде вживати нових заходів. Саме проти Москви. Дипломатія повинна працювати. Ми з українського боку робимо все для цього. Я хочу подякувати всім, хто нам допомагає. Дякую Америці за те, що команди наші працюють, що вони працюють конструктивно і результативно. Результат потрібен від Росії. Ми їм не віримо. Реально. Світ Росії не вірить. І вони повинні довести, що вони готові закінчити війну і готові не брехати світу, не брехати Трампу, не брехати Америці. Слава Україні!
All right, back with Hal Kempfer here. Very strong words, obviously, as you would imagine, against Russia there, talking about the sanction threat, talking about bringing up the fact that the Ukrainians were the first ones to put on the table an unconditional ceasefire that's been operative, Zelensky says, since March 11th. Russia rejected it here. So what did you take away from what Zelensky said there, Hal?
I think that's pretty clear. He says, we do not trust Russia. We do not trust them. I think that it actually kind of underlies the entire thing. And basically saying, look, we're going to see what's going to happen in the coming days, you know, because they have said things about dates starting for ceasefires in the past, like with the energy sector. That day came and went. Nothing happened. The thing is that Russia keeps targeting civilian sites. They keep targeting energy infrastructure sites. So he's basically taken away, you know, hey, we're going to go along with this, you know, but they feel that, and he's got a lot to go on there, that Russia has, you know, they agree to something at the table, and then as soon as they turn around, they make a pronouncement which throws in terms that were not agreed upon. And so he's got a key point there about Russia lying. Was a term that was, at least the term that was translated, lying to not just Ukraine, lying to President Trump about those agreements as well. Now, it's going to be, it is to be seen what Russia does. I think actions speak louder than words on this.
Yeah.
If they start attacking energy infrastructure sites in Ukraine, well, that's a clear indicator. If they start attacking commercial ships or port facilities, well, that's another big indicator. So we'll see what they do in terms of that. Now, I would mention one thing, though. There is a reason why Russia is big on getting this in place. A couple of technological developments in Ukraine with one of their homemade cruise missiles. It's a Neptune-type missile that they make there, and also a long-range drone. They've been having tremendous success with targeting Russian infrastructure. So that's why the Russians are saying, hey, look, let's have a ceasefire now because they know they're vulnerable.